How do Africans see Iran? Obviously, since the American Israeli attack on Iran, Iran has become a common discussion point. And when I talk about it with my American friends, they're surprised by my outlook. And I was honestly surprised by their surprise until I realized that once again I had underestimated American ignorance. I had an American friend ask me why I would have any positive feelings on Iran. And my response to them really shocked them. I told them, I grew up in Eritrea. The first time I heard about Iran was not in reference to the Middle East, Palestine, Israel. The first time I heard about Iran was in reference to South Africa. Because shortly after the Iranian Islamic Revolution of 79, Iran became an open, on the global stage, opponent of apartheid South Africa. For being apartheid, it severed diplomatic ties, it had a complete oil embargo on them in support of the liberation movements happening in South Africa. So when I was a kid and Iran was brought up in discussion by my uncles or family, it was in solidarity. It was a love for Iranian people. It was a love for how they participated in the liberation of South Africa. And where I grew up in Eritrea also tends to be mainly Muslim. We're Sunni Muslims as opposed to the Shia majority in Iran, but still we understand their culture more, I think, more than I think many Americans and Europeans tend to. I don't think Americans understand the Shia concept of martyrdom. You know, like my entire life in America since I've been here, whenever I hear Americans talk about like martyrdom, it's a joke. In their mind, it's, some ignorant, borderline, like caveman, like 16-year-old or adult man who's going to, blow himself up because he's been promised 72 versions. And it's such a belittling of the concept, like an obvious conscious belittling of the concept. Martyrdom isn't unique to Shia Muslims, Muslims as a whole, or even religious people. Martyrdom at its core is just willing to die for something you want to protect or believe in. Shia martyrdom has become religious doctrine because their greatest religious leaders have martyred themselves. And in the Shia faith, martyrdom is the highest honor. To give yourself for the love of your fellow people is the highest honor. And that religious tradition brings a sort of benevolence to Iranian society. Iranian society has a lot of problems. You know, um, there's a lot of internal division, a lot of it caused by the Western world, but there is a lot of division. But Iranian history and culture is a conscious historical decision to try to be moral. When when the Iranian population was faced with the South African apartheid regime, unlike the Western world and much of Asia, there was no discussion about the nuance of the rights of the native Africans compared to their their tyrannical Afrikaners. Iranians were simply, this is wrong, this is clearly wrong, there is no justification for this, and God would not approve. And so they completely closed off all interaction with the with the white South Afrikaner tyrannical regime until Africans liberated themselves. And so that's how I see, and how many Africans see, the relationship between Iran and Palestine. If Iran was willing to bring more heat onto itself, if Iran was willing to sacrifice when its revolution had just happened, when it did not benefit them to be anti-apartheid, why do Westerners and Americans think that Iranian support of Palestine and apartheid in their neighborhood is going to be less lasting, is less passionate and less honest at its core desire? Because I hear all the time that Iran doesn't really care about Palestinians, that it's PR, that really they do it to target Israel. And it is the most propaganda laden nonsense I have ever heard. One, the idea that you would need anything besides basic humanity and logic to not watch an entire people be brutalized, belittled, and slowly ethnically cleansed is insane. I don't think you need more than that to bring yourself to action. But if people are of good faith wondering why Iran has this relationship with like Palestine, research the relationship Iran had with South Africa during apartheid and with the liberation movements in South Africa. If Iran was willing to go out of its way and make sacrifices for a people in a group on a continent separated from it, over 1,000 miles away, to a group that could not offer much back. It's not like Iran was waiting to get some massive trove of resources from South Africa once they helped liberate it. It truly was a moral stand. And so I don't expect Iranians to be less ardent in the defense of their direct neighbors. Palestine has been brutalized and subjugated for over the entire lifetime of almost everyone in Iran. And the entire time they've been opposed to it. And they're one of the few countries who's made it clear, and the only country whose opposition has been lasting. And so, if Westerners think this that like America and Israel can simply invade Iran and topple the government by murdering, even their supreme leader, it just doesn't make sense. Do you know what else was happening while Iran was helping Africans liberate themselves in South Africa? In 1980, America helped Iraq invade Iran. This was shortly after the Revolutionary War in '79. So obviously, Iran's military infrastructure was destroyed. They were building societal infrastructure all over again. They were not well armed. They were not well resourced. And America honestly thought that if they just armed Iraq, that Iraq could take Iran. And even in that moment of weakness, Iranians fought back. Hundreds of thousands of people, somewhere between 200 and 500,000, depending on how you do the metrics and if you take civilians' death into account. But hundreds of thousands of people died in Iran protecting themselves from Iraqis, protecting themselves from Western subjugation at the hand of Iraqis. And the thing that really pushed them forward is their concept of like martyrdom. Because while the Iraqis had the help of Americans, while they were better armed, the Iraqis came as invaders. The Iraqi soldiers were simply doing what they were told. Iranians were fighting for their land, their history, and their people, but also because of how central martyrdom is to their culture and their faith. They were willing to martyr themselves in the thousands to stop that invasion, in the hundreds of thousands to stop that invasion. I don't know if this is true, but recent reporting out of Iran is that their supreme leader was murdered in his office, not because he couldn't go to a bunker, but because he said that the average person has nowhere to hide, so he's not going to hide. And so they murdered their supreme leader not in a bunker hiding, but openly in his office. They have given Iran a martyr who speaks to their soul in a way I don't think Westerners understand. Shia Muslims dominate Iran, but they're a large portion of the population of most Middle Eastern countries. And you have given them a martyr, the likes of which they haven't had in centuries, really. I am so worried about the scale this conflict will evolve into, especially when I hear the way Americans and Europeans talk about it. They almost make it seem as if it's a small event that what's happening. That Iran is a small country, a weak country, a broken apart country ready to fall. And all it reminds me of is when I was a kid back home hearing my uncles, my uncles were all soldiers in the Eritrean Revolutionary War, and so they were all a bit obsessed with military history. And they would tell me all the time how nothing surprises Europeans more than when black and brown people demand equality and are willing to die for it. That Europeans have spent so long forcing peoples and nations onto their knees that they actually do think that that is their natural state, and that they take any attempt to stand as rebellion. And so I don't know how this conflict will resolve itself. But the idea that this is going to be over in a couple of days or a week, and that this is not a turning point in history, is ridiculous. I honestly think that the average American citizen and the average European citizen who's okay with this happening, not because they approve of the war, but because they don't think that there's a great fallout, where they might not approve of America and Israel attacking Iran, but they're like, worst case scenario, it's like a minor conflict that'll resolve itself. It's going to be so much more than that.